Your husband never wanted that house opened while he was alive. The woman on the phone told me the morning after Richard's funeral. But now that he's gone, you deserve to know the truth. I stood frozen in my kitchen with my coffee growing cold in my hands while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking our backyard in Connecticut. For 42 years, my husband had guarded that beach house like it contained state secrets. He never raised his voice at me. Richard Harper had always been calm, measured, respectable. But whenever I asked about the old beach property on the Massachusetts coast, something in his expression changed. His jaw tightened. His answers became short. "It's just an old investment property, Evelyn," he would say before changing the subject. Over the years I stopped asking. That's what happens after 4 decades of marriage. You learn which doors stay closed. Richard had been dead for 3 days when that phone call came. 3 days since I sat beside a polished mahogany casket surrounded by white lilies while everyone told me what a wonderful man my husband had been. 3 days since my son Daniel stood beside me in a black suit with one arm wrapped around his wife Claire while they discussed estate paperwork before the funeral flowers had even started to wilt. I should have ignored the call. At 68 years old, I should have stayed home, folded thank you cards, and tried to figure out how to sleep alone in a king-sized bed that suddenly felt too large. But something about the woman's voice unsettled me. Not cruel. Not threatening. Sad. As though she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. By noon, I was driving north along the coast with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The ocean appeared beside the highway in flashes of gray beneath thick clouds. Richard had bought the beach house 12 years ago, shortly after his retirement. He always went alone. Just maintenance work, he'd say whenever he packed an overnight bag. Sometimes he stayed there 2 or 3 days. Once, he disappeared for nearly a week and came home quieter than usual, staring out windows like part of him had remained behind by the water. I remember asking him one night why he never wanted me there. He looked down at his dinner plate for a long moment before answering. "Some places are tied to painful things, Evelyn." I didn't press him after that. The beach house sat alone at the end of a narrow road lined with windswept dunes and weathered cedar fences. The sky above the Atlantic looked almost silver. I parked beside the crooked wooden steps and stared at the house for nearly a minute before getting out. It was smaller than I expected. White paint peeling near the shutters. Wind chimes swaying softly near the porch. The place didn't look sinister. It looked lonely. I unlocked the front door using the spare key I had found hidden in Richard's desk the night before the funeral. The hinges groaned as the door slowly opened. The house smelled like salt air, old wood, and something faintly floral beneath the dust. I stepped inside carefully, my heels clicking against faded hardwood floors. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a small bedroom with pale yellow walls and lace curtains moving gently in the ocean breeze. A child's room. My breathing stopped. There were stuffed animals sitting neatly on a twin bed. Children's books stacked carefully on a shelf. Framed drawings taped beside the window. And on the dresser sat a photograph of Richard smiling beside a young blonde girl I had never seen before. Written across the corner in faded ink were the words, "Summer with Grandpa Richard. Age 8. I do not remember how long I stood in that doorway staring at the photograph. Long enough for the ocean wind to push the curtains against the wall beside me. Long enough for my coffee-colored heels to begin aching against the hardwood floor. Richard looked younger in the picture. Happier somehow. The little girl beside him could not have been older than 8. She had long blonde hair tied back with a blue ribbon and a smile so wide it reached her eyes. One of Richard's arms rested gently on her shoulder while the other held a fishing pole. Behind them stretched the same gray shoreline only a few yards from the house. I picked up the frame carefully as though touching it. Too quickly might shatter whatever illusion remained of my marriage. Grandpa Richard. Not Uncle Richard. Not family friend Richard. Grandpa. My hands began trembling slightly. Richard and I only had one child. Daniel. And Daniel never had children. Claire had struggled with fertility issues for years, something she discussed openly at family dinners after too many glasses of wine. There was no granddaughter. No niece. No little girl I had somehow forgotten over 42 years of holidays, birthdays, and Christmas cards. Yet this room clearly belonged to someone deeply loved. Everything inside had been arranged with care. The bookshelf held worn copies of Charlotte's Web and Little Women. A faded pink sweater hung neatly over the back of a small rocking chair near the window. On the nightstand sat a seashell lamp beside framed drawings signed with the name Lily. My chest tightened as realization slowly settled over me. Richard had not simply visited this house. He had lived another life inside it. I walked farther into the room, my fingers trailing lightly across the edge of the dresser. Dust covered most surfaces, but not evenly. Some things had clearly been touched recently. A blanket folded too neatly. A coffee mug beside the sink downstairs without dust inside it. Fresh batteries inside the hallway clock. Someone had been here after Richard died. Or perhaps even before the funeral. Outside, waves crashed softly against the shore beneath a sky growing darker by the minute. The entire house felt suspended in time. I opened the closet slowly. Inside hung several winter coats, rain boots, and a child-sized yellow jacket that still had sand in the pockets. Beneath the hanging clothes sat a cardboard box sealed with blue tape. Across the top, in Richard's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Evelyn. When the time is right." I stared at the box without moving. During our marriage, Richard had never been emotional with words. He showed affection quietly, fixing my windshield wipers before storms, filling my gas tank before long drives, bringing me tea whenever migraines kept me awake. Even during difficult years, I never doubted he cared for me. But standing there inside that hidden bedroom, I realized love and honesty are not always the same thing. I knelt carefully and pulled the box into the center of the room. My knees protested against the floorboards as I peeled away the tape. Inside lay dozens of envelopes bundled with twine, stacks of medical records, photographs, and a leather journal worn soft at the edges. On top rested a single white envelope with my name written across the front. Evelyn. Just seeing his handwriting nearly undid me. I sat slowly on the edge of the twin bed before opening the letter. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the burden of silence finally belongs to you instead of me. I stopped breathing for a moment. Rain began tapping against the windows harder now, mixing with the distant sound of thunder over the Atlantic. I continued reading with shaking hands. There are things about our family I protected for many years. Not because I did not trust you, but because I was trying to protect you from choices Daniel made long ago. I frowned immediately. Daniel. My son's name seemed almost out of place on the page. Richard continued. The girl in the photographs is Lily Wells. She is not my daughter. She is not the result of an affair. But she became part of my life 18 years ago, after a tragedy that changed everything. If Daniel discovers you found this house before you understand the truth, he and Claire will try to stop you. Do not let them. I lowered the paper slowly into my lap while thunder rolled across the coastline outside. The silence inside the little bedroom suddenly felt heavier than before. Daniel and Claire had spent the last 3 days obsessing over estate documents, investment accounts, and property transfers. Claire had already asked twice whether I planned to sell my home now that I was alone. At the time, I thought she was being practical. Standing there in that hidden beach house, I began wondering if they had simply been nervous. My phone suddenly rang in my purse downstairs. The sound cut sharply through the quiet house. I froze instantly. It rang again. Then again. Slowly, I walked back toward the kitchen and pulled out my phone. Daniel's name filled the screen. I stared at Daniel's name glowing across my phone screen while rain battered the kitchen windows hard enough to rattle the glass. For a moment, I considered letting it ring until voicemail picked up. My son rarely called more than once unless something truly mattered to him. The phone rang a fourth time before I finally answered. Mom, Daniel said immediately, his voice tight and breathless. Where are you? I looked around the quiet beach house before answering. Why? Silence stretched for half a second too long. Then came Claire's voice somewhere in the background, muffled but sharp. Ask her directly. Daniel lowered his voice again. Mom, are you at the beach house? I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. Not grief this time. Awareness. I found Dad's spare key, I said carefully. I thought I should finally see the place. Another silence followed. I could hear movement on his end. Car doors shutting, wind, hurried footsteps. Daniel sounded nothing like the calm financial consultant, who usually spoke in measured tones about retirement portfolios and real estate trends. He sounded nervous. You should leave, he said quickly. The weather is getting bad out there. I glanced toward the darkening shoreline. I grew up in New England, Daniel. I know what rain looks like. Mom. His voice sharpened this time. Please. Just lock the house and come home. We can deal with all of Dad's properties later. All of Dad's properties. Strange wording. In 42 years of marriage, Richard only ever mentioned owning one vacation property. I sat slowly at the small kitchen table while staring at the envelope still lying open beside me. Did you know about Lily? I asked quietly. The silence that followed told me everything before Daniel even spoke. Somewhere in the background, Claire stopped talking completely. I heard Daniel inhale slowly through his nose. Mom, he said carefully now. Dad explained some things before he passed. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. So you did know. It is complicated. No, I replied softly. Complicated is forgetting anniversaries or arguing over money. This was a hidden child's bedroom inside a locked house your father never allowed me to enter. Daniel exhaled heavily. Lily is not who you think she is. Then who is she? Another pause. I would rather explain in person. Outside, lightning flashed across the ocean, illuminating the kitchen in cold white light for half a second. The house suddenly felt less abandoned now, less frozen in memory, more like a place built specifically to hide conversations nobody wanted exposed. Did Claire know too? I asked. Daniel hesitated again. Too long. Mom, just come home. Claire's voice rose sharply behind him. Tell her not to touch anything. The words landed heavily between us. Not to touch anything. Not are you okay? Not you should not be alone. Not I am sorry you found out this way. My son was worried about whatever remained hidden inside this house. I looked toward the hallway leading back to Lily's bedroom. Daniel, I said quietly, what exactly are you afraid I will find? He did not answer immediately. Then finally, in a low, exhausted voice, he said, Dad should have told you years ago. Before I could respond, the line suddenly disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly into my lap while thunder rolled again over the coastline. For several seconds I simply sat there listening to the storm and the ticking clock on the wall. Richard had always believed silence could protect people. That much I understood now. But silence also changes the shape of a family over time. It creates empty spaces where honesty should live. Looking back, I started noticing things I had ignored for years. The way Daniel and Richard sometimes argued quietly behind closed doors after holiday dinners. The tension whenever the beach house came up in conversation. The fact that Claire once referred to the property as that burden by the ocean, before quickly correcting herself when she realized I was listening. At the time I thought she meant maintenance costs. Now I wondered if she meant something else entirely. I stood and walked slowly back toward Lily's room carrying Richard's letter in my hands. The storm outside had darkened the sky enough that the room now glowed softly beneath the yellow light of the bedside lamp. I sat on the edge of the bed again and opened the leather journal from the box. The first page stopped me cold. June 14th. Lily asked me today why some families hide the people they love most. I did not know how to answer her. I turned the page carefully. Most entries were written in Richard's familiar neat handwriting. Some described ordinary things. Taking Lily fishing, helping her with school applications, bringing her soup during flu season. But underneath every small detail ran something deeper. Fear, guilt, responsibility. Then halfway through the journal, I found a folded newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The headline read, Local couple investigated for misuse of family trust funds. Beneath the headline were two names. Daniel Harper, Claire Harper. My pulse began pounding in my ears. The article was dated 11 years earlier. 11 years. My hands shook as I continued reading. No criminal charges were filed due to insufficient evidence, but questions remained regarding missing funds connected to a private youth assistance trust established by local businessman Richard Harper. I stared at the article while rain hammered against the roof overhead. Youth Assistance Trust. Lily. Suddenly the entire house felt different around me. Not like the scene of an affair. Not like evidence of betrayal. Felt like a shelter. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized my husband may not have been hiding this place from me at all. He may have been hiding it from our son. For a long time, I sat motionless in that small bedroom while the storm raged outside and Richard's journal rested open across my lap. The sound of rain against the roof blended with the distant crash of waves below the cliffs, creating the kind of lonely silence that makes old memories rise to the surface whether you want them to or not. I kept staring at Daniel's name in the newspaper clipping. 11 years ago. At the time, Daniel was building his financial consulting business in Boston, while Claire was finishing graduate school. They always seemed polished together. Ambitious. Organized. The kind of young couple other parents bragged about at country club dinners. Richard certainly did. He helped Daniel open his first office. He introduced him to investors. He even co-signed a business loan during the recession when banks stopped trusting anyone under 40. Looking back now, I realize there were cracks I ignored because mothers are very good at protecting the image of their children. I remembered one Thanksgiving nearly 12 years earlier when Richard and Daniel disappeared into the study after dinner. Their voices stayed low, but tense enough that even Claire stopped smiling at the table. An hour later, Daniel left early without dessert while Richard sat alone in the dark living room staring out the windows for nearly half the night. When I asked what happened, he simply said, "Your son made a mistake." I never pressed further. Families survive by stepping around certain truths. At least that is what I used to believe. Another gust of wind rattled the beach house windows hard enough to shake me from the memory. I closed the journal carefully and stood, carrying the newspaper clipping downstairs into the kitchen. The clock above the stove read nearly 7 in the evening. Daniel had not called back. Neither had Claire. That unsettled me more than if they had continued arguing. Silence from my son usually meant calculation. Richard used to say Daniel always thought 3 conversations ahead of everyone else in the room. At the time, he meant it as a compliment. I walked toward the sink and looked out at the dark ocean beyond the dunes. A single porch light glowed faintly from a neighboring cottage farther down the shoreline. Otherwise, the road looked deserted beneath the storm clouds. Then headlights swept briefly across the front windows of the house. My breath caught. A dark sedan pulled slowly into the gravel driveway outside. For one panic second, I thought Daniel had driven all the way from Connecticut. But when the driver stepped out beneath an umbrella, I saw a woman instead. She looked to be around my age, perhaps early 60s, wearing a navy raincoat and carrying herself with the cautious hesitation of someone approaching a wounded animal. She paused beneath the porch light before knocking softly against the front door. I opened it carefully. Rain blew sharply across the porch between us. The woman studied my face with tired blue eyes before speaking. "You must be Evelyn." Her voice was gentle, familiar somehow. I nodded slowly. "And you are?" She lowered the umbrella. "Margaret Wells." The last name hit me immediately. Lily Wells. The woman looked past me into the house with an expression so heavy with memory that my chest tightened instantly. "I was not sure you would come," she admitted quietly. "Richard hoped you would eventually." I stepped aside without speaking. Margaret entered slowly, brushing rainwater from her sleeves before looking around the kitchen. "Nothing changed," she whispered almost to herself. "He kept everything exactly the same." I watched her carefully while she removed her gloves. There was no arrogance in her. No trace of the glamorous secret mistress I had imagined during the drive north. She looked exhausted. Grief had hollowed her face in the same way it had hollowed mine these past few days. "You were the one who called me," I said. She nodded. "Richard asked me to if anything ever happened to him." I crossed my arms tightly. "Then maybe you should start explaining why my husband kept an entire second life hidden inside this house." Margaret closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Because Richard spent 18 years trying to protect Lily." "From what?" For the first time since entering the house, genuine fear flickered across her face. "From Daniel and Claire." The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Margaret pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat down slowly as though the story itself weighed too much to stand beneath. "Lily was only 8 when Richard met her," she began quietly. "Her parents died within months of each other. Richard funded a youth assistance trust through one of his charities to help children who had no family support. That is how he found her." I sat across from her without taking my eyes off her face. "Then why hide her from me?" Margaret looked down at her hands for several long seconds. "Because Daniel discovered the trust account years later. And once he realized how much money moved through it. She stopped herself. Outside, thunder rolled heavily over the ocean again. I leaned forward slowly. What did my son do? Margaret lifted her eyes to mine then, and the sadness in them frightened me more than anger ever could. Richard spent the last decade terrified that if Daniel gained control of the remaining trust assets, Lily would lose everything your husband promised to protect. Margaret's words settled over the kitchen like cold fog rolling in from the ocean. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The only sound came from rainwater dripping off the porch roof outside, and the old refrigerator humming softly against the wall. I stared at the woman sitting across from me, and tried to reconcile the reality in front of me with the marriage I thought I had lived inside for more than 4 decades. You are telling me my husband spent 10 years protecting a young woman from our own son, I said carefully. Margaret nodded once. Richard did not want to believe it at first either. I looked down at the folded newspaper clipping still resting beside Richard's journal. Daniel and Claire had always loved appearances, expensive vacations, charity galas, designer kitchens renovated every 5 years whether they needed it or not. Claire once spent nearly $800 on imported Christmas ornaments, while joking that ordinary decorations looked depressing. Richard laughed politely that night, but afterward I found him sitting alone in the den staring at old family photo albums instead of watching television. At the time I thought retirement had simply made him sentimental. Now I wondered how much disappointment he had been carrying silently beside me. What exactly happened with the trust? I asked. Margaret folded her gloves slowly before answering. Richard created the account to cover Lily's education, housing, and long-term stability. After losing her parents, she had no one reliable left. He wanted her protected before she turned 18. I frowned slightly. And Daniel gained access to the funds? Margaret hesitated. Not legally at first. Richard allowed Daniel's firm to help manage some investments connected to the charitable foundation. Seemed harmless in the beginning. Your son was successful, intelligent. Richard trusted him. A bitter ache rose slowly inside my chest. Trusted him. Richard had trusted Daniel because he was his son. The same reason I ignored warning signs for years. Then money started disappearing, Margaret continued quietly. Small amounts initially. Transfers buried inside larger investment movements. Richard noticed inconsistencies during an annual review. I closed my eyes briefly. Daniel had always been good with numbers. Even as a child he balanced his allowance in little notebooks and corrected restaurant bills when waiters made mistakes. Richard used to brag that our son could have worked on Wall Street if he wanted to. I opened my eyes again. Did Daniel steal from Lily? Margaret looked visibly uncomfortable hearing the words spoken aloud. Richard believed Daniel and Claire intended to repay everything before anyone noticed. But once Richard confronted him, things became much worse. Thunder rolled low across the coastline again. I remembered another strange evening from years earlier. Daniel arriving unexpectedly at our Connecticut home, just after midnight while Claire waited in the car outside. Richard met him in the driveway instead of inviting him inside. They argued quietly for nearly an hour beneath the porch light while I watched through the curtains upstairs. The next morning Richard canceled a planned golf trip and drove alone to the beach house for almost a week. When he returned he looked 10 years older. Why did Richard never tell me any of this? I whispered. Margaret's expression softened with something close to pity. Because he loved you. I almost laughed at how absurd those words sounded inside that hidden kitchen. People who love each other do not build secret lives. No, Margaret said gently. But they do sometimes carry impossible burdens for the people they love most. I looked away toward the dark ocean outside the windows. Somewhere out there waves continued crashing against the shoreline exactly as they had before Richard was born and exactly as they would after all of us were gone. Grief changes shape when betrayal enters it. It becomes heavier, stranger, less clean. Where is Lily now? I asked after a long silence. Margaret hesitated again before answering. Richard moved her several times over the years after Daniel kept trying to gain information about the remaining trust assets. A chill spread slowly across my arms despite the warmth inside the kitchen. Why would Daniel care that much? Margaret reached into her purse carefully and removed a thin folder secured with a rubber band. She slid it across the table toward me. Because the remaining trust assets are worth nearly $4 million. I stared at her without moving. $4 million. Richard and I had lived comfortably but not extravagantly. He drove the same silver Lexus for 12 years. I still clipped grocery coupons out of habit. We donated quietly to hospitals and local schools, but Richard never flaunted wealth. $4 million hidden inside a trust connected to this house and this girl I had never met. Margaret lowered her voice. Richard feared that after his death, Daniel and Claire would challenge the trust legally. That is why he prepared documentation here instead of keeping everything at your home. Slowly, I opened the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements, property records, legal correspondence, and handwritten notes from Richard. One sentence immediately caught my attention. If anything happens to me unexpectedly, Evelyn must be told the truth immediately before Daniel gains access to the remaining files. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Strange how shock eventually becomes clarity. For the first time since entering the beach house, my grief began giving way to something colder and steadier. Understanding. Daniel and Claire had not been worried about my emotional well-being after Richard's funeral. They had been worried about this house, about these documents, about me finding out what Richard had spent years protecting. My phone vibrated suddenly against the kitchen table again. Another call from Daniel. This time I did not answer immediately. I simply watched his name glow across the screen while rain continued sliding down the windows beside me like tears the house itself had been holding back for years. Daniel called 3 more times that night. I watched each call appear across my screen and disappear again while Margaret quietly brewed coffee in the small beach house kitchen as though she had done it 100 times before. Outside, the storm finally began drifting farther out over the Atlantic, leaving behind only scattered rain and heavy gray clouds moving across the moonlight. By 10 o'clock, the entire house smelled faintly of salt water, old books, and fresh coffee. Strange how quickly a place can stop feeling foreign once the truth inside it begins unfolding. Margaret sat across from me at the table, while I slowly sorted through the folders Richard had left behind. Every document seemed to reveal another layer of the life my husband carried in silence. Trust records, scholarship payments, property taxes, medical insurance forms for Lily dating back years. Richard had not been supporting a hidden mistress. He had been quietly raising a frightened young girl from the shadows while protecting her from my own son. Even thinking the words made my chest tighten painfully. Did Lily know about me? I finally asked. Margaret nodded softly. Richard spoke about you often. I looked up sharply. He did. He said you were the kindest person he had ever known. That is why he could never bear risking your relationship with Daniel. I looked back down at the paperwork in my hands. Kindness. Women like me are often praised for kindness right before people begin hiding things from us. I spent decades smoothing over arguments, planning holidays, remembering birthdays, forgiving small hurts before they hardened into larger ones. Somewhere along the way, everyone decided protecting my peace mattered more than respecting my right to the truth. Richard, Daniel, even Claire. Where is Lily now? I asked again quietly. Margaret hesitated before answering. Seattle. The answer surprised me. That far? Margaret nodded. Richard arranged for her to move there after Daniel tried contacting her directly 4 years ago. A chill ran through me. Contacting her for what? Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee mug before answering. To pressure her into signing control of certain trust distributions over to his firm. I stared at her in disbelief. You are telling me my son attempted to manipulate a young woman his father practically raised? Margaret's silence was answer enough. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the window overlooking the dunes. The rain had stopped completely now. Moonlight reflected silver across the restless ocean while seagrass bent softly in the wind. Somewhere behind me the old floorboards creaked as Margaret gathered papers into neat stacks the same way Richard apparently used to. For a moment I imagined him standing beside her in this kitchen late at night, carrying the burden of all this alone while I sat at home believing our marriage was simply entering its quieter years. I remembered one Christmas Eve 6 years earlier when Richard disappeared during dinner preparations claiming he needed to check on a burst pipe at one of his properties. He returned after midnight exhausted and emotionally distant. Later I discovered he had missed church service entirely, something he never willingly did. At the time, Daniel brushed it off casually. "Dad is getting forgetful," he joked while Claire laughed beside him. But now I understood. Richard had likely spent that night here. Protecting documents. Protecting Lily. Protecting all of us from a truth too ugly to expose during the holidays. My phone vibrated again. This time it was not Daniel. It was Claire. I almost ignored it, but something colder inside me now wanted to hear her voice. "Evelyn," Claire said immediately after I answered. Her tone sounded carefully measured, almost overly gentle. "Daniel is worried sick about you." I stared out toward the dark water. "That is interesting," I replied calmly, because concern was not exactly the first emotion either of you showed after Richard died. Silence. Then Claire exhaled slowly. "You found documents, did you not?" No denial. No confusion. Just immediate calculation. "You knew everything," I said quietly. "Not everything," she corrected quickly. "Richard was secretive with all of us. But you knew enough." Another silence followed. "Evelyn," Claire began carefully. "Richard became obsessed with that girl over the years. Daniel tried repeatedly to convince him that the trust was becoming financially irresponsible." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not compassion. Not regret. Money. "Her name is Lily," I said coldly. Claire paused. "Daniel only wanted to protect family assets." Family assets. The phrase sounded so polished, so professional, as though human beings could simply become numbers arranged neatly inside spreadsheets. "Richard left clear instructions regarding the trust," Claire continued. "There are legal complications now that he is gone, and certain documents may be misunderstood without context." I turned slowly from the window. Margaret watched me silently from across the kitchen table. "You mean documents proving Daniel stole from a dead orphans trust fund?" Claire's sharp inhale crackled through the phone line. "That is not what happened." "Then what did happen?" Claire lowered her voice. "Evelyn, please come home tomorrow and let the attorneys handle this properly." Attorneys. Not grief counselors. Not family conversations. Lawyers. Suddenly I understood exactly what frightened them. Richard had trusted me with the final decision. Not Daniel. Not Claire. Me. I looked around the quiet beach house one more time. The yellow lamp still glowing softly inside Lily's bedroom. The stack of journals on the kitchen table. The ocean breathing steadily beyond the dunes. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me shift away from grief and toward clarity. Richard had hidden this place for 18 years. But now the silence belonged to me. The next morning, the storm had passed completely. Sunlight spilled across the ocean in pale silver streaks while gulls drifted over the shoreline beyond the dunes. I woke in the beach house guest room wrapped in one of Richard's old cable-knit blankets, disoriented for several seconds before memory returned all at once. Richard was dead. My son had betrayed him. And somewhere in Seattle, a young woman named Lily had spent years hiding from the very family I thought I understood completely. The house felt strangely peaceful in the morning light. Almost ordinary. Margaret had already left by the time I walked downstairs. A handwritten note sat beside the coffee pot in neat, careful script. "Richard trusted you for a reason. Do not let fear make your decisions now." Beneath the note was a phone number with a Seattle area code, written underneath the name Lily. I stared at the paper for a long moment before folding it carefully into my pocket. Outside, ocean air drifted through the open kitchen windows carrying the scent of salt and wet cedar. For the first time in days, my mind felt clear instead of numb. Grief had not disappeared. It sat quietly beneath everything still. But now another emotion existed beside it. Resolve. I spent the next 2 hours sorting through Richard's files methodically at the kitchen table. Years ago, before Daniel was born, I worked as a legal secretary for a small Hartford law office. Most people eventually forgot that part of my life after I became a wife and mother. Richard never did. You notice details other people miss. He used to tell me whenever we played cards together and I caught him bluffing. Sitting there beside the ocean, I finally understood why he left the documents for me instead of an attorney. He knew I would look carefully. Several records immediately stood out once I organized everything chronologically. The trust account irregularities began 12 years earlier, shortly after Daniel's firm gained temporary oversight authority for certain investments connected to Richard's charitable foundation. At first, the missing amounts were small enough to appear accidental. $20,000 shifted between accounts. $35,000 labeled as temporary liquidity adjustments. Then larger sums began moving. Funds disappeared into shell investment groups connected indirectly to one of Claire's consulting partnerships. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. Richard had documented everything quietly for years without confronting authorities publicly. He had even hired forensic accountants twice according to receipts buried near the bottom of one folder. One note written in Richard's handwriting caught my attention immediately. If Daniel is exposed publicly, Evelyn will lose her son forever. That sentence broke something open inside me more painfully than any financial betrayal could. Richard had not stayed silent to protect Daniel's reputation. He stayed silent to protect me from the impossible position of choosing between my husband and my child. Tears finally burned behind my eyes for the first time since entering the beach house. Not loud dramatic sobbing, just exhaustion. 42 years beside a man who carried this burden quietly because he loved us both too much to destroy either one. My phone buzzed against the table shortly before noon. This time it was an unfamiliar number from Seattle. I answered carefully. Mrs. Harper? The voice sounded young. Nervous. This is Lily. I closed my eyes briefly. Hello, Lily. Silence filled the line for a second. Then she spoke softly. Margaret told me you found the house. I looked toward the hallway leading to the yellow bedroom. Yes. Another pause. I am sorry, she whispered unexpectedly. Your husband never wanted to hurt you. The tenderness in her voice startled me more than anger would have. I had prepared myself for defensiveness, resentment, maybe even entitlement. Instead, she sounded frightened and deeply sad. Did you love him? I asked quietly before I could stop myself. Lily answered immediately. He saved my life. Simple. Certain. No hesitation. I pressed my fingers lightly against my forehead while sunlight moved slowly across the kitchen floorboards. Richard was the only adult who ever kept his promises to me. Lily continued softly. When my parents died, everyone kept talking about responsibility and paperwork and temporary arrangements. Richard just showed up every week. He taught me how to fish, helped me with homework, made sure I never felt abandoned. My throat tightened painfully. Somewhere along the way, Richard had become a father figure to someone who desperately needed one, while slowly losing his own son to greed and ambition. Did Daniel threaten you? I asked carefully. The silence on the other end of the line answered before her words did. A few years ago, she admitted quietly. He wanted access to some trust documents after Richard refused to transfer authority. I stared out toward the ocean again. What did he say? Lily hesitated. He told me I was manipulating an old man and draining money from his real family. Real family. The words settled heavily inside my chest because I could hear Daniel saying them perfectly. Calm. Controlled. Convincing himself morality always belonged to whoever held legal ownership. I suddenly remembered Claire making an offhand joke during a dinner party years earlier. People become very generous with other people's money once emotions get involved. At the time everyone laughed politely. Richard did not. Lily, I said quietly. Richard left instructions protecting you after his death. Her breathing caught softly over the phone. Then Daniel does not know everything yet. Yet. Not relief. Fear. I looked down at the stacks of evidence covering the kitchen table and understood something cold and clear all at once. Daniel and Claire were not finished fighting for control of this trust. And now that Richard was gone, the only thing standing between them and Lily was me. By late afternoon, the beach house no longer felt like a place built from secrets. It felt like evidence. Every drawer I opened, every file I sorted, every note written in Richard's careful handwriting revealed the same quiet pattern. He had spent years preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. The realization exhausted me more than grief itself. I sat alone at the kitchen table with legal folders spread around me while sunlight faded slowly beyond the dunes outside. Richard had organized everything with painful precision. Account numbers, attorney contacts, recorded conversations transcribed word for word, copies stored in duplicate envelopes marked with dates and instructions. He had been building protection around Lily piece by piece while still trying to leave a path back to Daniel if our son ever changed. That part hurt the most. Richard never stopped hoping. Even after everything. My phone remained silent for most of the afternoon. No calls from Daniel. No messages from Claire. The quiet itself felt unnatural. Daniel never tolerated uncertainty well. As a child, he used to panic whenever plans changed unexpectedly. At 12 years old, he once cried because a summer vacation hotel reservation was misplaced and we had to stay somewhere different overnight. Richard laughed gently at the time and called him a man who needs control. Sitting alone beside the ocean all these years later, I realized how dangerous that need for control had become once money entered the picture. Around 5 o'clock, I finally opened the last locked drawer inside Richard's desk upstairs. Inside sat a small cassette recorder beside several labeled tapes and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For Evelyn only." My hands hesitated slightly before opening it. Inside was another letter written only weeks before Richard died. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, then matters between Daniel and the trust have likely reached the point I feared most. I know discovering all this after my death must feel unbearable. But please understand something before anger hardens inside you. I never hid Lily because I loved you less. I hid her because every time I tried to tell you the truth, I saw what it would destroy inside our family." I stopped reading for a moment and pressed my fingers against my eyes. The house creaked softly around me beneath the ocean wind while sunlight dimmed across the bedroom floor. Richard continued. "Daniel was not always this man. For years I convinced myself his mistakes came from pressure, ambition, fear of failure. Claire encouraged the worst parts of him, but the choices remained his. By the time I understood how far they were willing to go for money, Lily was already frightened of them. I promised her she would never be abandoned again." I stared at the page while memories surfaced one after another with painful clarity. Claire convincing Daniel to move Richard's charitable donations into higher-yield strategies. Daniel becoming defensive anytime Richard asked detailed financial questions. Family dinners growing tense whenever inheritance planning came up. I used to think all families experienced these small fractures with age. Now I saw the deeper pattern hidden underneath them. At the bottom of the envelope sat a small brass key taped beside a handwritten note. "Safety deposit box. Hartford Trust Bank. Only if necessary." My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Richard had prepared multiple layers of protection. He expected legal conflict after his death. Before I could think further, tires crunched suddenly against the gravel driveway outside. I froze instantly. A car door slammed. Then another. Slow footsteps crossed the porch. This time I did not panic. I folded Richard's letter carefully and slipped the brass key into my pocket, just as someone knocked firmly against the front door downstairs. I descended the staircase slowly, my heartbeat steady despite the tension tightening through the house. Through the frosted glass beside the door, I could already make out Daniel's silhouette. Claire stood slightly behind him with her arms crossed tightly against the cold ocean wind. I opened the door without speaking. Daniel looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot and his expensive navy coat hung wrinkled from what was probably hours inside a car. Claire, however, looked composed as always. Perfect hair. Neutral makeup. Calm expression carefully arranged like armor. "Mom," Daniel said quietly. "Thank God you are okay." I stepped aside without answering. They entered cautiously, both immediately scanning the kitchen table covered in folders and documents. Claire's eyes locked onto the paperwork for half a second before she masked the reaction completely. Daniel removed his gloves slowly. "You should have called us." "Why?" I asked calmly. "So you could arrive before I opened the desk upstairs?" Claire inhaled sharply while Daniel rubbed one hand across his jaw. "Mom," he began carefully, "there are things about Dad's foundation you do not fully understand." I almost smiled at how familiar those words sounded now. Everyone protecting me from understanding. Everyone deciding what truths I could survive. "Then explain them," I said softly. Daniel glanced briefly toward Claire before answering. "Dad became emotionally manipulated over the years by people connected to the trust. He lost objectivity." "People," I repeated. "Or Lily specifically?" Silence spread through the kitchen. Claire stepped forward finally. "Evelyn." Richard was transferring enormous amounts of family wealth into someone outside the family structure. Daniel simply tried to establish proper oversight. Family structure. Again, the same cold language. Human beings reduced to financial categories. You mean you tried gaining control of money that did not belong to you? I replied quietly. Daniel's expression hardened slightly for the first time. Dad promised me stewardship of the foundation years ago. And when he changed his mind? Daniel looked away briefly. That tiny movement told me more than any confession could have. Claire folded her arms tighter. Richard became paranoid near the end, she said carefully. He started recording conversations and hiding assets. It was unhealthy. I looked directly at her then. People usually start hiding things when they no longer feel safe around their own family. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the walls around us. Then Daniel spoke in a voice so tired it barely sounded like my son anymore. Mom, he whispered. Dad left something else here, did he not? Daniel's question lingered in the kitchen long after the words left his mouth. The ocean wind moved softly through the cracked window above the sink, stirring the edges of the paper spread across the table between us. For a moment nobody spoke. Claire stood near the doorway with her arms folded tightly, while Daniel watched me with the same guarded expression Richard used to wear whenever he expected bad news from a doctor's office or a lawyer's call. My son looked older suddenly. Not because of grief. Because secrets age people faster than time ever does. I walked slowly toward the kitchen table and gathered Richard's letters into a neat stack before answering. Your father left many things here, I said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Mom, please. I looked directly at him for the first time since he arrived. No. You do not get to rush this conversation anymore. Silence settled heavily across the room. Claire glanced toward Daniel as though silently calculating whether speaking would help or make things worse. Eventually Daniel pulled out one of the wooden chairs and sat down across from me. The same chair Richard had probably occupied hundreds of nights while trying to decide whether he still recognized his own son. Dad thought I stole from Lily, Daniel said finally. His voice sounded flat now. Exhausted. Did you? I asked calmly. He looked down at the table instead of answering immediately. It was more complicated than that. I almost smiled sadly at the phrase. Complicated. Families always use complicated when the truth becomes too ugly to say plainly. The investment accounts were underperforming, Daniel continued carefully. Claire and I believed we could temporarily restructure certain assets and return everything before Lily ever noticed. Claire stepped forward quickly. Richard completely overreacted once he discovered the transfers. I turned toward her slowly. $4 million does not sound temporary. Claire's expression hardened slightly. Those numbers grew over time because Richard refused to cooperate once emotions clouded his judgment. Emotions. Again that word. As though compassion itself were some dangerous weakness. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face tiredly before speaking again. Dad stopped trusting me after that. I thought about Richard sitting alone in this beach house night after night protecting documents instead of enjoying retirement beside his family. I thought about the sadness hidden behind his quiet smiles during holidays. The sleepless nights. The headaches. The way he sometimes stared at Daniel with an expression I never fully understood until now. No, I said softly. Your father stopped trusting you after you proved money mattered more to you than people. Daniel flinched as though the words physically struck him. Claire inhaled sharply beside the doorway. That is unfair, she said coldly. We built successful lives through hard work, while Richard handed enormous wealth to someone outside this family. Outside this family. There it was again. The invisible line Claire drew around humanity itself. I reached into my sweater pocket slowly and removed the brass key Richard left me. Both Daniel and Claire froze the instant they saw it. Neither tried hiding the reaction. Dad gave you the key. Daniel whispered. No, I replied quietly. He trusted me with it. The difference mattered. We all knew it. I stood and walked toward the old cabinet beside the fireplace where Richard kept several locked drawers. The smallest compartment opened smoothly beneath the brass key. Inside sat a thick sealed envelope and a digital recorder beside one final notarized document. Daniel went pale immediately. Claire's composure cracked for the first time all evening. Mom, Daniel said quickly, standing now. Before you open that, you need to understand Dad was not thinking clearly near the end. I looked at my son carefully. The expensive watch on his wrist. The tension in his posture. The fear beneath all his polished control. For years I believed motherhood meant protecting your child no matter what. But standing there in that quiet beach house, I realized real love sometimes means finally seeing someone clearly instead of endlessly excusing them. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a signed amendment to Richard's estate plan along with several pages of handwritten instructions. My eyes moved quickly across the first paragraph while the room around me seemed to grow very still. If Daniel or Claire attempt to challenge Lily's trust after my death, all remaining discretionary assets under my control are to transfer immediately into the Evelyn Harper Educational Foundation under Evelyn's sole authority. I looked up slowly. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. Claire's face had gone completely white. Richard had protected Lily one final time. But he had also protected me. The estate amendment effectively removed Daniel and Claire from controlling anything connected to the remaining trust assets if they attempted interference. And judging by their expressions, Richard never told them. Dad would not do this, Daniel whispered. I held up the notarized signature silently. Richard's handwriting looked steady, certain, final. Claire recovered first. This can be contested, she said immediately, though even she sounded less confident now. I looked at her calmly. You may try. Then I pressed the button on the digital recorder. Richard's voice filled the room softly but clearly. Older. Tired. Honest. If you are hearing this, then Evelyn already knows the truth. Daniel, I loved you every day of your life. But love without accountability destroys people. You and Claire crossed lines I could no longer ignore. Lily deserved safety. Evelyn deserved honesty. And this family deserved better than what greed turned us into. Daniel lowered himself slowly back into the chair, as though his legs no longer trusted him to stand. I watched my son stare at the floor while his father's voice echoed through the beach house one last time. Outside, evening sunlight spilled across the ocean in long golden bands. The storm was finally gone. I walked quietly toward the windows facing the shoreline and opened them wide. Salt air rushed into the house immediately, cool and clean against my skin. Behind me nobody spoke. After 18 years of silence, the truth had finally entered the room.